Tell us, why did you write the book, The Wuhan Cover-Up, The Terrifying Bioweapons Arms Race?
I had to understand the etiology of the gain-of-function research. And I found very quickly that it went back to the era of bioweapons, and that a lot of the same scientists were involved, and the agencies, and particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, was deeply involved. The first mission of the CIA, when it was started in 1947, was called Operation Paperclip. And Operation Paperclip was an effort to get the Nazi scientists, many of whom were sentenced to death or who were facing prosecution at Nuremberg, to smuggle them out on rat lines and put them to work developing bioweapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons and missile systems in the United States. And the US bioweapons program inherited the culture from Germany and from Japan. Japan was the one nation that really had used bioweapons at an industrial scale. They were fighting the Chinese since the mid-30s, and they were using bioweapons. They did live vivisections on 3,000 human beings, mainly Chinese, but people of every race, including US soldiers that they captured. And they would give them a disease, and then they would dissect them alive without anesthesia and extract their organs. What I show is that the US bioweapons program, from the beginning, inherited not just the cultures and the techniques, but also the kind of moral bankruptcy of the Nazi and Japanese scientists that was incredibly persistent within that program up until the modern time. The bioweapons program in our country became very, very big, so that by 1969, it had achieved what they called nuclear equivalence. In other words, we could kill people with bioweapons as effectively as we could with nuclear weapons. At one point, that we could exterminate most of the US population using bioweapons at a cost of about 29 cents per life. And in 1969, President Nixon surprised everybody by unilaterally terminating our bioweapons program.
Where we have previously had scientists, some of the best people that we could possibly find in the United States, working on weapons of war, we now have scientists devoting their efforts toward saving life rather than destroying life.
He pushed through a bioweapons treaty that most of the nations in the world signed to stop all research and to stop all stockpiling and use of bioweapons. And it was by then a giant industry, and there were many, many people involved in the intelligence agencies and the military and in private industry, and they were all kind of seething for many years. And then in 2001, the anthrax attacks happened a week after 9/11 and led to the very hasty passage of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act had a passage in it that effectively relaunched the bioweapons arms race. The Patriot Act said we're not revoking the Geneva Protocol or the bioweapons treaty, but we are saying that any federal official who participates in bioweapons research cannot be prosecuted under those treaties. So it launched this new bioweapons arms race. Initially, the Pentagon was reluctant to do it openly because experimenting with bioweapons was a hanging offense under Geneva. So they sent the research over to Anthony Fauci's shop, to NIAID, which became the official biodefense agency of the United States government.
But how does bioweapons research go into a health agency?
Because bioweapons research is always done coterminously with vaccine research. Every offensive bioweapon program requires a vaccine. Unlike chemical weapons, with bioweapons, there's always blowback 100% of the time, which means if you infect your enemy, your troops are also going to get infected. And so you cannot launch a bioweapon unless you first have the antidote and you've inoculated all of your civilians and your soldiers with the antidote, and then you can release it. And Anthony Fauci was given a 68% raise by the military because of these new military responsibilities. He continued to do that to 2014. And that year, 3 of the bugs escaped. And 300 scientists sent a letter to President Obama asking him to shut down Anthony Fauci's research on gain of function, saying that it was highly likely that he would start a global pandemic. And President Obama issued a moratorium and shut down 18 of the worst projects by Anthony Fauci, or ordered them shut. In the end, he really didn't shut them. He instead moved the research offshore, where he would be out of the oversight of these troublesome scientists. They moved research to Ukraine, to the former Soviet state of Georgia. But some of the worst research they moved to a Chinese lab that was run by the Chinese military, the Wuhan lab.
Given the strategic competition between the United States and China, that seems like a very odd choice of a place to be offshoring bioweapons research.
Well, the Chinese were intensely interested in this kind of research because the SARS virus had started over there in China in 2002, which the Chinese suspected was a US-made bioweapon. And they immediately began putting large amounts of money into developing their own biodefense program. At the same time, the US, the Pentagon, and the US intelligence agencies were deeply interested in having eyeballs in China. And the US intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA through USAID, became the biggest funder of bioweapons research at the Wuhan lab. The Pentagon was the second largest funder, and NIH was the third largest funder. All gain of function. Science should be illegalized, it should be criminalized, and we should have an international treaty. We should agree to open door transparency with all the people who now are enemies. You know, all these people are working on these very, very frightening bugs, and we need to stop it.
Do you consider SARS-CoV-2 to be a product of bioweapons research?
SARS-CoV-2 is certainly the product of bioweapons research. It's known that there was a defective negative air system in the lab. It was known that throughout the lab there were very shoddy procedures. So there were 1,000 ways that these creatures could have escaped.
So what's been the impact of this Wuhan cover-up and this ongoing arms race?
I mean, the biggest impact that people know about is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected an entire generation of American kids, that changed our relationship with our government, changed our relationship with the United States Constitution, reshuffled our foreign policy relationships with countries all over the world, and really ushered in a model for shifting to totalitarian or authoritarian rule from democracy. You know, virtually all of the liberal democracies in Europe pivoted to do things that they'd never done before, which is to override the guarantees of constitutional rights, to make it suddenly permissible for government to censor people because it was public health, to close all the churches, to shut down jury trials, to do all this very intrusive track and trace surveillance. All things that people would have been very, very uncomfortable with prior to the pandemic, but suddenly became governments ordering every business to shut down, ordering people to put on masks, ordering people to social distance, to stay in their homes, and then submit to unwanted, in many cases, medical procedures, which is their vaccination program. And so we saw that happening all over the world, and I think that is probably the biggest impact so far from the bioweapons program.
A lot of people are suffering a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder from everything that went along with COVID that you've outlined. Why should people read this book now?
It's important to study it to make sure that it doesn't happen again, to see the places that people made mistakes.
So you're a litigator, Bobby. If you could depose any of these cover-up co-conspirators, which ones would you depose?
The most important ones to depose would be Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, Jeremy Farrar, who's the head of the Wellcome Trust, which is the British version of the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates himself, and Avril Haines, who was the deputy director of the CIA and is now the director of national intelligence and has played a very, very critical role in pandemic preparedness and response and in the cover-up. I would also want to depose Peter Daszak, and if I could get jurisdiction, some of the Chinese scientists, Xi Jinping, and then the US scientist, Ralph Barrett. Those, I think, are the principal villains in the book.